Story 1. The Watcher in the Woods. The rustling noise from the back seat sent a jolt of icy terror through Daniel's veins. His hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The car sped down the narrow dirt road, bouncing over the uneven terrain, but his mind was focused entirely on the noise behind him. He didn't dare look back. He didn't want to see what was there. The noise was subtle at first, almost like the gentle shift of fabric, but there was no mistaking it. Something was in the car with him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, the breath leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. The car's engine roared as he pressed down harder on the gas pedal, the tires spinning on the loose gravel before catching traction. But no matter how fast he drove, the rustling continued. It was as if the thing in the back seat was toying with him, letting him know it was there, just out of sight. His pulse thundered in his ears, his thoughts a chaotic mess as he tried to figure out what to do. He couldn't pull over, couldn't stop. Stopping meant facing whatever was in the car with him, and he wasn't ready to do that. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, trying to push the sound out of his mind. But it was impossible. The rustling grew louder, more insistent, until it was all he could hear. The trees on either side of the road blurred together as the car sped through the forest, the headlights casting long, flickering shadows that danced and twisted in the darkness. Daniel's mind raced. Had the thing from the woods followed him into the car? How had it gotten inside without him noticing? The questions swirled in his head, but there were no answers, only the growing sense of dread that threatened to swallow him whole. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but he quickly looked away. He didn't want to see it. He couldn't see it. The mere thought of making eye contact with whatever was back there sent shivers down his spine. He focused instead on the road, on the path ahead, even as his peripheral vision caught fleeting glimpses of movement in the back seat. The road twisted and turned, the forest growing denser, the trees looming closer as if trying to encroach on the narrow strip of road. The fog thickened, rolling in like a living thing, reducing his visibility to just a few feet ahead. The headlights cut through the mist, but the world beyond remained hidden, as if the road led to nowhere, and then, as suddenly as it had started, the rustling stopped. The silence was deafening, the absence of sound more terrifying than the noise itself. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps as he gripped the steering wheel. He wanted to believe that whatever it was had left, that the nightmare was over, but he knew better. The silence was a trap, a momentary pause before the storm. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. He could feel the weight of the presence in the car, even though he couldn't see it. It was there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The tension was unbearable, the fear building inside him like a coiled spring, ready to snap. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, and this time he couldn't resist the urge to look. The mirror was foggy, the reflection distorted, but there just at the edge of his vision he saw it. A dark, shadowy figure, barely visible in the gloom, sitting in the back seat. Daniel's breath hitched in his throat, his blood running cold. The figure was featureless, an amorphous shape that seemed to shift and waver in the darkness. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken on a life of their own, coalescing into a being that defied explanation. For a moment, neither of them moved. Daniel stared at the figure in the mirror, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The thing in the back seat didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that pressed down on him from all sides, and then, slowly, the figure began to move. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in the shadows, but there was no mistaking it. The thing was leaning forward. Daniel's pulse quickened, panic surging through him as the figure drew closer, inch by inch, its form becoming more defined, more real. His instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of the car, but he was trapped. The road was too narrow, the forest too dense. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. All he could do was watch in helpless terror as the figure closed the distance between them, its presence filling the car with a cold, unnatural chill. The figure's face, or what passed for a face, came into view, a featureless void that seemed to absorb the light, pulling it into its depths. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his mind reeling as the thing reached out a hand, the fingers long and thin, like twisted branches. The hand hovered inches from his shoulder, and Daniel's skin prickled with fear, a deep primal terror that sent shivers down his spine. The cold radiating from the figure was unbearable, seeping into his bones, freezing him in place. And then, just as the hand was about to touch him, the car hit a bump in the road, jolting Daniel out of his paralysis. The sudden movement broke the spell, and without thinking, he slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. The world lurched, the force of the stop throwing him forward against the seatbelt. For a moment, everything was a blur of motion and sound, the car spinning out of control before finally coming to a stop in the middle of the road. Daniel sat there, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The car was still, the engine idling, the headlights cutting through the fog. He didn't dare move, didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again. The fear was too great, the terror too overwhelming. He had to get out. He had to get away from whatever was in the car with him. With trembling hands, he reached for the door handle, his fingers slick with sweat. He fumbled with the latch, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he tried to force the door open. It was stuck, the latch refusing to budge. Panic surged through him, a wave of fear so intense that it nearly choked him. He yanked on the door handle, his mind screaming at him to get out, to escape. But the door remained closed, the latch jammed tight, and then, just as suddenly, the latch clicked and the door swung open. Daniel tumbled out of the car, hitting the ground hard. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, but he didn't care. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing as he stumbled away from the car, his eyes darting around in the darkness. The fog was thick, the world reduced to a shadowy blur. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches interlocking above to create a canopy that blocked out the sky. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the kind of sound that should have been soothing, but instead felt ominous. Daniel's heart raced as he backed away from the car, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do. All he knew was that he had to get away, had to escape the thing that had been in the car with him. But the road was empty, the forest silent. There was no sign of the figure, no indication that it had followed him. The car sat in the middle of the road, the headlights cutting through the fog, but the back seat was empty. He didn't trust it. He couldn't. The fear was too raw, too deep. He had seen it, had felt it. The thing had been there, in the car with him, and now it was gone. But where? The thought sent a chill down his spine, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He couldn't stay here. He had to keep moving, had to find a way out of the forest before it was too late. With one last glance at the car, Daniel turned and started down the road, his steps quick and unsteady. The fog pressed in on him from all sides, the darkness thick and oppressive. The road wound through the trees, a narrow strip of gravel that seemed to go on forever, leading him deeper into the unknown. He walked for what felt like hours, his mind a blur of fear and confusion. The trees loomed overhead, their branches forming a tangled web that blocked out the sky. The fog was so thick that he could barely see a few feet ahead, the world reduced to a shadowy blur, and then Out of the darkness, a light appeared. It was faint at first, barely more than a glimmer in the fog, but it grew brighter as he approached. Daniel's heart leaped with hope, his pace quickening as he realized what it was, a house. Or at least, the outline of one. The building emerged from the fog like a ghost, its edges blurred and indistinct. It was an old, ramshackle house, the kind that had been abandoned for years, left to rot in the middle of the forest. The windows were dark, the paint peeling from the walls, but there was no mistaking it, a light was on inside. Daniel's mind raced as he approached the house, his thoughts a chaotic mess. Who lived out here, in the middle of nowhere? Was this a safe haven, or was it another trap? But he didn't have time to think, didn't have time to question. The thing from the car was still out there, still hunting him, and this was the only place to hide. He reached the front door and hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The light inside was dim, flickering, as if it could go out at any moment. But it was warm, inviting, a beacon in the darkness. With a deep breath, Daniel turned the knob and pushed the door open. The interior of the house was just as old and decrepit as the exterior. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and the floor was creaky and uneven. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes and skin, but the light he had seen it, hadn't he? Daniel stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. It was empty, the furniture covered in dust, the windows boarded up. But there, on a small table in the corner, a candle burned, its flame flickering in the still air. He approached the candle, his heart pounding in his chest. It was the only source of light in the room, the only thing that seemed alive in this dead place. But as he drew closer, he noticed something else, something that made his blood run cold. On the wall, next to the table, were words scratched into the plaster. The letters were jagged, uneven, as if they had been carved with a knife. And the message they spelled out was clear. It sees you. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his eyes widening in horror. He stumbled back, nearly knocking over the table in his haste. The candle flickered, its flame dancing in the darkness, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The message was fresh, the plaster still crumbling around the edges of the letters. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew what was out there in the woods, someone who had tried to warn him. But it was too late. The door behind him creaked, and Daniel spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The door had swung shut, the only exit now blocked. The room was silent, the only sound the soft crackle of the candle's flame, and then, from the shadows, came the rustling. It was louder this time, more deliberate. The sound of something or someone moving through the darkness. Daniel's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he backed away from the sound, his mind racing. He had to get out. He had to escape. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The house was a trap, the walls closing in on him, the darkness alive with unseen horrors. The rustling grew closer, the sound reverberating through the room. Daniel's pulse quickened, his thoughts a chaotic mess. He reached for the candle, his only source of light, and held it out in front of him. The flame flickering wildly, the shadows shifted, twisted, taking on shapes that defied explanation. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was the same figure he had seen in the car, the same faceless, shapeless entity that had haunted him. But now it was here, in the house with him, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The candle's flame flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, but the figure didn't falter. It kept coming, its form shifting and twisting in the darkness. Daniel backed away, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure was too close, too powerful. There was no escape, the figure reached out a hand, the same long, twisted fingers that had tried to touch him in the car. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest as the hand drew closer. The cold was unbearable, a deep, bone-chilling cold that seeped into his very soul. The figure's hand hovered inches from his face, and Daniel knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core that this was the end. And then, just as the hand was about to touch him, the candle went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the figure disappearing into the shadows. Daniel's heart raced, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he stumbled back, his hands outstretched in the darkness, but the figure was gone. The rustling had stopped, the room silent once more. Daniel stood there, trembling, his mind reeling from the terror he had just experienced. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating, overwhelming, but the figure was gone. For now. He didn't know how long he stood there, frozen in place, his mind a blur of fear and confusion. But eventually, he forced himself to move, to find his way out of the house. The darkness was thick, impenetrable, but he had to try. He had to escape. He fumbled for the door, his hands shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The door creaked open, and he stumbled out into the night, the cool air hitting him like a slap in the face. The fog had lifted, the night sky clear and full of stars. The road stretched out before him, empty and silent, the trees towering above like silent sentinels. But the fear was still there, a deep, gnawing terror that clung to him like a shadow. Daniel didn't look back. He didn't dare. He just kept walking, his steps quick and unsteady, his mind reeling from the horrors he had witnessed. The road wound through the forest, the trees closing in on either side, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop because he knew, deep down, that the figure wasn't gone. It was still out there, still hunting him. And no matter how far he ran, how fast he fled, it would always be there, watching, waiting. The night was silent, the forest still, but Daniel knew that he was never truly alone. Story 2: The Drowning Silence. It was the perfect summer vacation, or at least, that was what Jessica had thought when she first booked the trip. A week at a remote lakeside cabin, miles away from the city and the stress of her job. It was exactly what she needed: peace, quiet, and a chance to clear her head. The brochure had promised serenity, a private dock, and clear, cool waters perfect for swimming. But as she drove down the winding dirt road that led to the cabin, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tall pine trees on either side of the road seemed to close in on her, their dark branches forming a tunnel that blocked out the sky. The sun, which had been shining brightly when she left the city, was now obscured by thick clouds, casting the world in a dull, gray light. The road was narrow and uneven, twisting through the dense forest as if it were trying to lead her somewhere she didn't want to go. Jessica's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the lake. But all she saw were shadows deep, dark shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. She had rented the cabin online, drawn in by the photos of its charming rustic appearance and the promise of complete solitude. The listing had shown a cozy wooden cabin nestled among the trees, with a porch that overlooked the lake. It was exactly the kind of place she had been looking for, a retreat where she could unplug from the world and find some peace. But as she finally pulled up to the cabin, Jessica's excitement turned to unease. The cabin was there, just as it had been in the photos, but it looked different somehow. Older, more weathered. The wooden planks that made up the exterior were warped and discolored, the windows dirty and streaked with grime. The porch, which had seemed so inviting in the pictures, now looked rickety and unstable, the wood creaking under the weight of the wind. She parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, but there was something else, too, something sour and metallic that made her wrinkle her nose. She looked around, expecting to see the lake, but all she saw were trees. The forest loomed around the cabin, thick and impenetrable, as if it were trying to swallow the building whole. Jessica grabbed her bags from the back seat and made her way to the front door. The steps leading up to the porch groaned under her weight, and she had to be careful not to trip on the uneven boards. The door was old, the paint peeling, and the doorknob felt cold and greasy in her hand. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The interior of the cabin was dim, the only light coming from the small windows that lined the walls. The furniture was old and mismatched, the kind of pieces you might find at a garage sale. There was a musty smell in the air, like the cabin hadn't been aired out in years. But it was quiet, eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that made Jessica's skin prickle with unease. She had expected the sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. But there was nothing. Just silence. She set her bags down on the dusty couch and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. It was just an old cabin, she told herself. Nothing to be afraid of. She had come here to relax, to escape the noise and stress of the city, and that was exactly what she was going to do. She walked over to the nearest window and looked out, hoping to catch a glimpse of the lake. But all she saw were trees. The forest pressed in on the cabin from all sides, the thick underbrush making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Where was the lake? The brochure had shown the cabin right on the water, with a private dock and a rowboat. But there was no sign of it, no glimmer of sunlight reflecting off the water. Just trees, dark and foreboding, their branches swaying in the wind. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine, and she turned away from the window, her heart beating a little faster. Maybe the lake was on the other side of the cabin, she thought. She hadn't explored the property yet, hadn't had a chance to see everything. There had to be a lake. It was the whole reason she had rented the cabin in the first place. She grabbed her jacket from the couch and headed for the back door. The wooden planks creaked under her feet as she stepped out onto the porch, the air cool and damp against her skin. The backyard was overgrown, the grass tall and unkempt, but she could just make out a narrow path leading through the trees. Jessica followed the path, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of pine needles that covered the ground. The forest was dense, the trees growing closer together the further she went. The path twisted and turned, winding through the underbrush like a snake, leading her deeper into the woods, and then, finally, she saw the lake. It was a small, circular body of water, nestled in the heart of the forest like a hidden gem. The water was dark, almost black, and perfectly still like a sheet of glass. There was no dock, no rowboat, just the lake and the trees that surrounded it, their reflections mirrored in the water. Jessica walked to the edge of the lake and knelt down, her fingers brushing the surface of the water. It was cold, colder than she had expected, sending a shiver up her arm. She pulled her hand back and wiped it on her jeans, her eyes scanning the shoreline. There was something unsettling about the lake, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The water was too still, too dark. There were no ripples, no signs of life, no fish jumping, no insects buzzing above the surface. It was as if the lake were frozen in time, untouched by the world around it. She stood up and took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence was overwhelming, the quiet pressing in on her from all sides. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, but the sound was muted, distant. Jessica turned and made her way back to the cabin, her footsteps quick and uneven. The path seemed longer on the way back, the trees growing taller, their branches interlocking above to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. The cabin was a welcome sight when it finally came into view, the wooden structure standing out against the dark green of the forest. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place oddly comforting. The cabin was dim, the only light coming from the fading afternoon sun that filtered through the windows. The silence was still there, but it was different, now more oppressive, more suffocating. Jessica walked over to the couch and sank down onto the cushions, her mind racing. There was something wrong with this place, something that she couldn't quite put her finger on. The lake, the silence, the way the trees seemed to close in on her, it all felt wrong. She reached for her phone, needing the reassurance of a connection to the outside world. But when she looked at the screen, her heart sank no signal. The bars were empty, the words "no service" staring back at her like a taunt. She tried calling anyway, dialing her sister's number, but the call didn't go through. The line was dead, the silence on the other end unnerving. She tried again and again, but each time the result was the same. No signal, no connection. Jessica set the phone down, her hands shaking. She was alone, completely cut off from the world. The cabin, the lake, the forest, it all felt like a trap, a place that was designed to keep her there, isolated and helpless. She stood up and walked to the kitchen, needing something to do, something to distract herself from the growing sense of unease. The cabinets were old and creaky, filled with mismatched dishes and dusty glasses. She found a kettle and filled it with water, setting it on the stove to boil. As she waited for the water to heat up, her mind kept drifting back to the lake. The dark, still water, the silence that seemed to press down on her, the way the trees loomed over the shoreline like silent guardians. There was something wrong with that lake, something that made her skin crawl just thinking about it. The kettle whistled, snapping her out of her thoughts. She poured the hot water into a mug and added a tea bag, watching as the dark liquid swirled around the cup. The steam rose in lazy tendrils, curling up towards the ceiling, filling the cabin with a warmth that did little to dispel the cold knot of fear in her stomach. Jessica took the mug and walked back to the couch, sinking down into the cushions once more. She sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through her body, but it did little to calm her nerves. The silence was still there, still oppressive, still suffocating. She set the mug down on the coffee table and picked up her phone again, hoping that maybe the signal had come back. But it was still dead, the screen showing the same taunting message, no service. The thought of spending the night here, alone in the cabin, sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't want to stay, didn't want to be here when the sun went down and the darkness took over. But there was nowhere else to go, no way to leave. She was trapped, alone in the woods with only the silence and the lake for company. The hours dragged on, the sun sinking lower and lower in the sky, casting the cabin in long shadows. Jessica tried to distract herself, tried to read, to watch a movie on her laptop, but nothing held her attention. Her mind kept drifting back to the lake, to the silence, to the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the darkness to fall. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the cabin was plunged into darkness. Jessica fumbled for the light switch, her hands shaking as she flipped it on. The old, yellowed bulbs flickered to life, casting the room in a dim, sickly light. The silence was deafening now, the kind of silence that made your ears ring, made your thoughts seem too loud. Jessica sat on the couch, her eyes darting around the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls seemed to close in on her, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. Trying to find a way in, she picked up her phone again, desperate for a connection, but the screen was still blank, still taunting her with those two words, no service. Jessica stood up, pacing the length of the room, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here, couldn't spend the night alone in this cabin with the silence and the darkness. She had to leave, had to get out of here before it was too late. But where could she go? The road was long and winding, the forest dense and impenetrable. The lake was a dead end, the water dark and still, the silence suffocating. She was trapped, a prisoner in this cabin, with no way to escape. As the hours passed, the silence grew louder, more oppressive. Jessica could feel it pressing in on her, could feel the weight of it on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The darkness outside seemed to seep into the cabin, the shadows growing longer, darker, more menacing. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard it a sound. A faint, distant sound that broke through the silence like a knife. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the lake. Jessica froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was faint, barely audible, but there was no mistaking it. It was the sound of water, of something moving in the lake. She stood there, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, her mind racing. What was out there? What was in the lake? The sound grew louder, more insistent. It was a splashing sound, like something or someone was moving through the water, getting closer and closer. Jessica's mind screamed at her to run, to hide, but her body refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, as the sound grew louder, more urgent, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than ever, the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical force. Jessica stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes fixed on the door. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, didn't dare make a sound. The cabin was deathly silent, the only sound the rapid beating of her heart, the only movement the faint trembling of her hands. The air was thick with fear, the kind of fear that made your skin crawl, made your mind race with thoughts you didn't want to think. And then she heard it, a knock at the door. The sound was sharp, sudden, startling in the stillness of the cabin. Jessica jumped, her heart leaping into her throat, her breath catching in her chest. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Her mind was a chaotic mess, her thoughts racing. Who could it be? Who was out there, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? The knock came again, harder, more urgent. The door rattled on its hinges, the sound echoing in the silence of the cabin. Jessica's mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to do something, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen with fear, her eyes locked on the door, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than ever, the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical force. Jessica stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes fixed on the door. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, didn't dare make a sound, and then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, faint and distant, moving away from the cabin towards the lake. Jessica's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic mess. Who or what was out there? What was in the lake? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers, only the growing sense of dread that threatened to swallow her whole. She had to get out, had to leave the cabin before it was too late. She couldn't stay here, couldn't spend another moment in this place. The lake, the silence, the darkness, it was all too much, too overwhelming, too terrifying. But as she turned to leave, she heard it again, the knock at the door. A T was louder this time, more forceful, more insistent. The door rattled on its hinges, the sound echoing in the silence of the cabin. Jessica froze, her heart leaping into her throat, her breath catching in her chest. The knock came again, harder, more urgent. The door rattled on its hinges, the sound echoing in the silence of the cabin. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Her mind was a chaotic mess, her thoughts racing. Who could it be? Who was out there, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? The knock came again, harder, more insistent. The door rattled on its hinges, the sound echoing in the silence of the cabin. Jessica's mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to do something, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen with fear, her eyes locked on the door, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than ever, the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical force. Jessica stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes fixed on the door. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, didn't dare make a sound, and then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, faint and distant, moving away from the cabin towards the lake. Jessica's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic mess. Who or what was out there? What was in the lake? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers, only the growing sense of dread that threatened to swallow her whole. She had to get out, had to leave the cabin before it was too late. She couldn't stay here, couldn't spend another moment in this place. The lake, the silence, the darkness, it was all too much, too overwhelming, too terrifying. But as she turned to leave, she heard it again, the knock at the door, ... It was louder this time, more forceful, more insistent. The door rattled on its hinges, the sound echoing in the silence of the cabin. Jessica froze, her heart leaping into her throat, her breath catching in her chest. The knock came again, harder, more urgent. The door rattled on its hinges, the sound echoing in the silence of the cabin. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Her mind was a chaotic mess, her thoughts racing. Who could it be? Who was out there, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? The knock came again, harder, more insistent. The door rattled on its hinges, the sound echoing in the silence of the cabin. Jessica's mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to do something, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen with fear, her eyes locked on the door, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped, the silence returned, more oppressive than ever, the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical force. Jessica stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes fixed on the door. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, didn't dare make a sound, and then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, faint and distant, moving away from the cabin towards the lake. Jessica's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic mess. Who or what was out there? What was in the lake? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers, only the growing sense of dread that threatened to swallow her whole. She had to get out, had to leave the cabin before it was too late. She couldn't stay here, couldn't spend another moment in this place. The lake, the silence, the darkness, it was all too much, too overwhelming, too terrifying. But as she turned to leave, she heard it again, the knock at the door. This time, the door burst open before she could react, the force of it sending her stumbling back. A gust of cold air rushed into the cabin, carrying with it the smell of the lake, the sour, metallic scent that had been hanging in the air since she arrived. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness, was a figure. Tall, thin, and dripping wet, with water pooling at its feet, the figure stepped into the cabin, its presence filling the room with a cold, suffocating dread. Jessica's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest as the figure moved closer. She could see it now, see the waterlogged clothes clinging to its body, the dark hair plastered to its face, the hollow eyes that stared at her with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through her. The figure opened its mouth, and a gurgling sound escaped, like water bubbling up from a deep, dark place. It took another step towards her, its wet, pale hand reaching out, water dripping from its fingertips. Jessica stumbled back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body refused to move. The figure was too close, too overwhelming. There was no escape. The figure reached out, its cold, wet fingers brushing against her arm. The touch was like ice, sending a shiver up her spine, her skin prickling with fear, and then the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were barely more than a whisper, but they echoed in the silence of the cabin, reverberating in Jessica's mind. The figure's hand tightened around her arm, the cold seeping into her bones, freezing her in place. Jessica's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the figure's grip tightened, pulling her closer. The smell of the lake was overpowering now, the sour, metallic scent filling her nostrils, making her gag. The figure leaned in closer, its hollow eyes staring into hers, its breath cold and damp against her skin. Jessica's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic mess, but there was no escape, no way out. And then, just as suddenly, the figure let go. Jessica stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure stood there, staring at her, its hollow eyes unblinking, its presence overwhelming. "You need to leave," the figure said, its voice low and gurgling. Before it's too late, Jessica's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic mess. She had to leave, had to get out of this cabin, had to escape the lake, the silence, the darkness. But the figure was still there, blocking her path, its hollow eyes staring into hers. "Go," the figure whispered, its voice barely more than a breath. "Go now, before it's too late." Jessica didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the wooden floor, her mind a blur of fear and confusion. She burst out of the cabin, the cold air hitting her like a slap in the face, the darkness of the forest closing in around her. But she didn't stop, didn't look back. She ran down the path, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. The trees loomed over her, their branches interlocking above to form a canopy that blocked out the sky, the darkness suffocating, overwhelming, and then, finally, she saw it, the car. It was parked where she had left it, a beacon in the darkness, the only thing that seemed real in this nightmare. Jessica reached the car and yanked the door open, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she peeled out of the driveway, the tires spinning on the loose gravel before catching traction. She didn't look back, didn't dare. The cabin, the lake, the silence, it was all behind her now, but the fear was still there, a deep, gnawing terror that clung to her like a shadow. She drove down the winding dirt road, the trees blurring together as she sped through the forest, the car bouncing over the uneven terrain. The clouds had cleared, and the moon was out now, casting the world in a pale, silvery light. But Jessica didn't notice, didn't care. All she wanted was to get as far away from that cabin, that lake, as possible. As she drove, her mind kept replaying the events of the night, the fear, the darkness, the figure in the cabin. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched, that the silence was still following her, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, just as she thought she was safe, she heard the sound of water dripping in the back seat. Jessica's blood ran cold, her breath catching in her throat as she glanced in the rearview mirror. But there was nothing there, just the empty back seat, the darkness of the forest outside. She shook her head, trying to shake off the fear, the paranoia. It was over, she told herself. She was safe. The cabin, the lake, the silence, they were all behind her now. But as she drove, the sound of dripping water continued, faint but persistent, like the distant echo of something she couldn't escape, and Jessica knew, deep down, that she was never truly alone. Story 3. The Echoes in the Abandoned Asylum. It was a place shrouded in mystery and fear, a decaying relic of the past that loomed over the small town like a shadow. The old asylum had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its walls crumbling, but the stories about what had happened there had never faded. For years, the locals had whispered about the strange occurrences within its walls, the ghosts of the patients who had never left, and the screams that could still be heard on quiet nights. For Anna, it was the perfect subject for her next project. She was a photographer, specializing in capturing the eerie beauty of abandoned places. Her work had taken her to ghost towns, forgotten factories, and crumbling mansions, but the asylum was different. It was more than just a building. It was a monument to suffering, a place where darkness had seeped into the very walls. The idea of photographing the asylum had come to her after hearing one of the locals mention it in passing. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and Anna had found herself in conversation with a few of the older residents at the local diner. They had been friendly, welcoming even, but their demeanor had changed when she mentioned the asylum. "You don't want to go there," one of them had said, his voice low and serious. "That place is cursed. Bad things happened there. People who go and don't always come out," another had nodded in agreement, her eyes narrowing. "It's not safe. There are things in there that shouldn't be disturbed." But Anna had dismissed their warnings. She was no stranger to spooky stories. Every town had its legends, its haunted houses and ghostly tales. She had made a career out of photographing those places, capturing their eerie beauty and the sense of history that clung to them like dust. And so, despite the warnings, she had set out to visit the asylum. The road leading to it was long and winding, cutting through thick woods that seemed to stretch on forever. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The air was cool and damp, the kind of chill that settled in your bones and made you shiver. As she drove, the asylum slowly came into view, its silhouette rising above the treetops. It was a massive building, a sprawling complex of stone and brick that had once housed hundreds of patients. Now it was a hollow shell, the windows dark and empty, the roof caved in at several points. The grounds were overgrown with weeds and brambles, the trees encroaching on the crumbling walls, as if nature were trying to reclaim what had been taken. Anna parked her car at the edge of the property and stepped out, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight of the asylum. There was something about it, something that made her heart race and her skin prickle with unease. It wasn't just the decay, the sense of abandonment. It was something deeper, something that seemed to radiate from the building itself. But she pushed the feeling aside. She was here to work, to capture the beauty in the decay, the history in the ruins. She grabbed her camera from the back seat and slung it over her shoulder, then made her way toward the entrance. The front doors were massive, made of thick oak that had weathered the years surprisingly well. They were slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges, as if inviting her in. Anne hesitated for a moment, the warnings of the locals echoing in her mind, but then she took a deep breath and pushed the doors open. The interior of the asylum was dark, the only light coming from the few windows that hadn't been boarded up or shattered. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy, swirling around her as she stepped inside. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, crumbling plaster, and pieces of furniture that had been left to rot. But it was the silence that struck her the most. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, made your thoughts seem too loud. The air was heavy with it, oppressive, as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Anna raised her camera and began to take pictures, the click of the shutter echoing through the empty halls. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs, the faces of the patients staring out at her with hollow eyes. Some of the rooms still had furniture, rusted bed frames, broken chairs, and peeling wallpaper that told the story of a place that had been abandoned in a hurry. As she moved deeper into the asylum, the sense of unease grew stronger. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows longer, as if the building were coming alive around her. She could feel the weight of the place pressing down on her, the history of suffering that clung to the walls like a stain. But she kept going, driven by the need to capture it all. She photographed the crumbling walls, the broken windows, the graffiti that had been scrawled on the walls by those who had come before her. She ventured into the basement, where the air was damp and the walls slick with mold, capturing the eerie beauty of the decay. It wasn't until she reached the old operating theater that she began to feel the first flicker of fear. The room was large and circular, with rows of seats that climbed up the walls, forming a kind of amphitheater. In the center of the room was an old, rusted operating table, the leather straps still attached, the metal gleaming dully in the faint light. Anna's breath caught in her throat as she raised her camera. There was something about the room, something that made her skin crawl. She could almost hear the echoes of the past, the screams of the patients who had been brought here, the whispers of the doctors who had performed unspeakable acts in the name of science. She took a step forward, her foot crunching on something brittle. She looked down and saw a bone, small and fragile, lying on the floor. She stared at it for a moment, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. How long had it been there? How many others were hidden in the shadows of this place? She took a few more pictures, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. The sense of unease had grown into something more, something darker. The silence was oppressive, the air thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic, like blood. She turned to leave, her steps quick and unsteady. The corridors seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker, the air colder. She could hear her own breathing, loud and ragged, echoing off the walls. And then she heard it, a sound, faint and distant, coming from somewhere deep within the asylum. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like the tapping of a finger against the wall. It was steady, deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. Anna's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the sound was getting closer. She turned, her camera dangling from her neck, her eyes scanning the darkness. The sound was coming from the end of the corridor, from the direction she had just come from. It was too dark to see, the shadows too thick, but she could feel it, the presence, the weight of something moving towards her. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. And then she saw it, a figure, tall and thin, emerging from the shadows. It was shrouded in darkness, its features obscured, but there was no mistaking the sense of malice that radiated from it. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its footsteps echoing in the silence. Anna's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic mess. She didn't understand what she was seeing, didn't want to understand. All she knew was that she had to get out, had to escape. But as she turned to flee, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low and guttural, barely more than a whisper, but it echoed through the corridor, reverberating in her mind. The figure took another step forward, and Anna stumbled back, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to. Leave," the figure interrupted, its voice sharp and commanding. Now. Anna didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing off the walls, her heart pounding in her chest. The corridors seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows closing in around her, the air thick with the stench of decay. But she didn't stop, didn't look back. The figure's voice echoed in her mind, urging her to leave, to get out before it was too late. She stumbled through the darkened halls, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, her mind racing. Finally, she burst through the front doors, the cool air hitting her like a slap in the face. She didn't stop, didn't dare. She sprinted across the overgrown lawn, her legs burning with exhaustion, her heart racing. When she reached her car, she fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped them. But she managed to get the door open, and she threw herself inside, slamming the door behind her. The engine roared to life, and she peeled out of the driveway, the tires spinning on the loose gravel. She didn't look back, didn't want to see if the figure was following her. All she knew was that she had to get as far away from that place as possible. As she sped down the winding road, the trees blurring together on either side, she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The figure, the voice, the overwhelming sense of malice, it was all too much, too terrifying. But the fear was still there, a deep, gnawing terror that clung to her like a shadow. She drove for what felt like hours, the road twisting and turning through the dark forest, until she finally saw the lights of the town in the distance. The sight was a relief, a beacon of safety in the darkness, but even as she pulled into the town, her mind was still racing, the fear still gnawing at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the figure was still out there, waiting for her. She parked the car in front of the small motel where she was staying and hurried inside, her heart still pounding in her chest. The lobby was empty, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioner. She approached the front desk and rang the bell, her hands still shaking. The night clerk appeared a moment later, a tired-looking man with graying hair and a weary expression. He glanced at Anna, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Anna nodded, though she didn't feel all right. She felt like she was still running, still trying to escape the darkness that had followed her from the asylum. Just tired," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Long day." The clerk nodded sympathetically and handed her the key to her room. "Get some rest," he said. "You look like you could use it." Anna mumbled a thank you and took the key, her hands still trembling. She made her way to her room, the fear still gnawing at her, the sense of being watched still lingering. When she reached the room, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The room was small and plain, with a bed, a dresser, and a television, but it felt safe, secure. The lights were bright, the air warm, and for the first time in hours, she felt like she could breathe. She sank down onto the bed, her mind still racing. The figure, the voice, the overwhelming sense of malice, it was all too much, too terrifying. But the fear was still there, a deep, gnawing terror that clung to her like a shadow. She tried to shake it off, tried to convince herself that it was over, that she was safe. But the fear was too deep, too raw. She couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, still waiting for her. She lay down on the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the figure, heard the voice, felt the overwhelming sense of malice. It was like a nightmare that she couldn't escape, a darkness that she couldn't outrun. Finally, after what felt like hours, she drifted into a restless sleep, her dreams haunted by the figure, by the voice, by the darkness that had followed her from the asylum. But even in her sleep, she couldn't escape the fear, and when she woke the next morning, the fear was still there, gnawing at her, whispering in her ear. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, the room bright and warm, but the fear was still there, a dark shadow that clung to her like a second skin. She got dressed, her movements slow and deliberate, the fear still gnawing at her. She had to leave, had to get out of this town, had to put as much distance between herself and the asylum as possible. But as she packed her bags, the fear grew stronger, the sense of being watched more intense. It was like a weight on her chest, a hand around her throat, suffocating, overwhelming. She grabbed her camera, her hands shaking, and stuffed it into her bag. But when she went to close the bag, her fingers brushed against something cold, something smooth. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she reached into the bag and pulled out the object, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a photograph, her photograph. She stared at it, her mind reeling. The photograph was one she had taken at the asylum, a shot of the old operating theater, the rusted table in the center of the room. But there was something wrong with it, something that hadn't been there when she had taken the picture. In the background, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, tall, thin, shrouded in darkness, and it was looking straight at her. Anna's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. The photograph slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. Landing face up, the figure stared back at her, its eyes hollow, its presence overwhelming. She backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, her mind racing. The fear was too much, too intense. It was like a living thing, a darkness that had followed her from the asylum, a shadow that she couldn't escape. And then, from the corner of the room, she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of a finger against the wall. The fear surged, overwhelming her, suffocating her. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in, the shadows growing darker. She turned, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, but the room was empty. And yet the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, echoing in her mind. Anna backed away, her eyes wide with terror, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows seemed to move, to shift, to take on a life of their own, and then she saw it, a figure, tall and thin, emerging from the darkness, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its eyes hollow and empty. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, its voice low and guttural, echoing in the silence of the room. Anna's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing, her mind screaming at her to run, to escape, but there was no escape. The figure moved closer, its presence filling the room, the air thick with fear, and then, just as it reached her, the figure stopped, its hollow eyes staring into hers. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice barely more than a breath. And in that moment, Anna knew that it was right. There was no escape, not from the asylum, not from the darkness, not from the fear. And as the figure reached out, its hand cold and smooth, Anna's world went black. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.